So, like Colby said, this movie has a pretty unique perspective on what malls can be, have been, etc. But before we kind of get into that, so how many people, when you were a teenager or a young person, when you said, I'd like to find a place of community, a place where I can walk to the different amenities, but have a level of independence and security, something that functions as a third place and brings me in community with my peers. When you were when those of us in this room were teenagers, were we going to a park or a town square or a downtown? No, we went to malls. So everybody of a certain generation does understand that malls, bastion of commerciality that they are, do serve a greater purpose or a different purpose, whether they meant to or not. And guess what? They actually did. This movie that we're about to see has this perspective of creative people, a sense of community and belonging versus a mall. They set it up as community and residential living and existing neighborhoods versus the bastion of capitalism and suburbia that we think of when we think of malls. But they also ask the question, how can we make this mall not just belong to the capitalists and the developers? How can we make the mall belong to us? And what I would like to share is that the mall has always belonged to community. And in fact, malls are one of the best proofs of the values of urbanist ideals. Concepts like walkability, accessibility, community are celebrated in malls, and they are a proof of how vital those things are to human life. So before I start talking about why I think that, this book is by Alexandra Lang. It's called Meet Me at the Fountain. A lot of these historical facts and ideas come from this book. Alexandra Lang is, as Colby said, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She writes about urban design, urbanist issues, architecture. Her works are really awesome. If you're familiar with my other work as Scraps Designs, it's very focused on public art and play. She wrote a book called The Design of Childhood that essentially made me what I am. So highly recommend her work. This book in particular, if you're interested in these issues. So, okay, history of malls. So, okay, we think of malls, we think of the 1950s, we think of suburbia. We had all of these people moving to residential areas, and there wasn't existing commercial stuff. Most of the time back then, when you needed to go shopping, you would go downtown. Well, you build all these houses out in the sticks, there's no downtown. Okay, they've got to go downtown, but they don't want to go downtown. What do? Department stores were king back then. Everything came from department stores. So a lot of them thought, okay, well, maybe we'll build a few standalones. We'll try to zhuzh up our downtown stores. So they're going out and they're hiring all these famous architects and artists to help them make their stores more attractive. One of those architects was named Victor Gruen. Gruen was a refugee, World War II refugee from Austria. And he was helping out some California stores. I can't remember the name of the department store. I've also come off 3 days of camping, just so you know. I got back from the Ozarks like 2 hours ago, so forgive me if I'm a little. So Victor Gruen, in the 1950s, he's zhuzhing up these department stores, and he ends up in a layover in Detroit. And he sees in Detroit that the same problems are happening throughout America. It's not a New York problem, it's not a California problem, it's happening everywhere. And he thinks up this idea where he says, what these poor people need, these people who don't have history, they don't have what we had in Europe, these lovely town squares and villages where you can walk down and there's a sidewalk cafe and all of the little businesses that you know and need are within walking distance, and maybe there's a fountain and maybe there's a town square where we can all get together. How can we bring that to these new suburban communities of America? Thus the mall. And that truly was how malls began, was an attempt to bring the urbanist values of European cities and in coastal cities to a degree, but the walkability, the eyes forward on the street, the focused on people, not cars, was the goal of the original mall. And through the 1950s, that is what they were, 50s and even into the 60s. There were doctor's offices. There were, yes, retail department stores were still, started out as anchors, just like they are now. But there was post office. There was library branches in malls. And they really were community gathering spaces for people. In fact, famously, Jane Jacobs, who is the founder of urbanism as we know it, she sang malls' praises. She went and visited several of Victor Gruen's malls, and she wrote a piece for Architectural Forum saying that they were amazing and what a valuable contribution to communities. So they had cred. And many of them did really unique things. These were world-class architects building them, interior designers, sculptors, putting in fountains and whatnot. And in fact, there is one mall in Dallas called North Park that is, to this day, one of the finest repositories of contemporary and modern art. They have world-class selections of contemporary and modern sculpture throughout the mall. They have a rotating collection. They even built an adjacent sculpture garden because they've just housed so much of it. And that's one example. There's lots of other ones that are not maybe quite that grand. There were also a lot of malls that were in downtowns. I was like, okay, this is working. Maybe if we just put it back in downtowns, we'll get people coming. And in fact, downtown Tulsa had a couple of these. The old Bartlett Square was built off that mindset where, hey, we need to focus on people, creating spaces for people, not cars. And so they actually closed off quite a few streets there. And now that was an outdoor thing. That was not as much focused on shopping, but it definitely was intended to bring people out and give them a pedestrian space. But there was a full-blown mall in downtown Tulsa. I can't remember when it closed, we looked it up. But what is now the BOK Tower, that super block, that was a downtown mall. It had a skating rink, had a Sears, it was a mall. And they thought, what is now annoying and separates people by putting this super block together and making it hard to get around the middle of downtown, they were doing that because they thought, well, this is people-centric, this is community-focused because we're making it a space, cars don't come, you park once, you get out, you do your shopping, you enjoy community. So, once upon a time, malls were full of, and they were focused on beauty in their interiors. They wanted to make them accessible, there were benches, everything was very wide and open. So, malls really were based on a very different concept than what we think of. Before I get into the transition, I sound like I'm singing their praises so much. The intent was there, the goals were there. Key difference is that when push came to shove, they were actually made very clear by the Supreme Court, these are still private spaces. There was a Supreme Court case in 1968 that was actually, it ended up being reversed, spoiler alert. But the first time the question of are malls public spaces came up before the Supreme Court in 1968, it was actually a group of union protest. There was a strike happening with one of the employers at the mall, and it ended up going, and the mall tried to shut it down. They claimed, hey, this is a public forum, it's public space. And they said, no, it's not, it's ours. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, of all people, argued in support of the union protesters, and it was enshrined in Supreme Court decision that yes, malls are public spaces, and you have the right to free speech in a mall. However, 4 years later, that was reversed, and in a different, very similar, but the court makeup had changed. And that has been maintained. Malls are private space. You cannot have a protest in a mall. You cannot behave as you would in public spaces in malls. So all of this grand dream of what the malls could be and how they are public spaces and they preserve community does fall apart at that point. This is something for us as Tulsans to be very aware of because we have multiple public spaces, not malls, but parks that are privately run. They fashion themselves as public spaces. They are not public spaces. They would be supported by that same Supreme Court decision. If you tried to have a protest at the gathering place, they would be well within their rights to shut you down. It's private space. Guthrie Green too. So just something to keep in mind as Tulsans. Not necessarily mall related, but something I thought worth pointing out. So malls, they're pretty great up till this point, but then they become a victim of their own success. This innate value for this gathering space that humans have, they will come regardless of how loud, cramped, jangly we make the space. So that's when we begin to turn. And that's also around the time that those Supreme Court decisions were happening. So at that point also, the flip happened where instead of malls following development, development followed malls. At the same time, the exteriors started becoming less important. They still did focus on making the interiors nice, always a lot of plants, a lot of natural light, but we started investing less in having an attractive outside and more in maybe a roller coaster, something like that. So this is the beginning of what we think of as malls, because malls came up that time I'm talking about where we had, empty boxes and roller coasters. We had a strong middle class. We could buy things from Abercrombie and Fitch, not Walmart. We had extra money to spend on an Orange Julius instead of something Orange Julius has no nutritional value, We're buying that because we got fun money as a society. We no longer have fun money as a society.
So how do you feel exactly about Eastland and the way that it has been taken over by private corporations that are also national? What's the impact on the community with that? Because they also closed other national brands like Toys R Us and different things that were around that area that were building up economically, and the impact that it has on those apartment complexes over there.
Eastland is tricky.
Crime.
Yeah.
Full
Because
disclosure, we talked about this.
Yeah.
I'm putting you on the spot.
Eastland's tricky because they didn't have the same development pattern all the way out to 129th the way we did in South Tulsa or even Promenade Mall. Eastland was built around the time that Promenade was, and they were both farther out. But because, and this fun fact, if you didn't know why East Tulsa didn't develop the way other parts in the same kind of ring outward from downtown, there's a lot of reasons, but a big part of why it ended up kind of going the way it did is they have a very thin topsoil. You can't get down very far before you hit rock. And so it's hard to do large scale development in East Tulsa because of the geology. And there's many other factors, racism, immigration, et cetera. But so with regards to the mall, Eastland didn't pop off. The areas surrounding Eastland did not pop off quite as much as other mall areas. So they were the first to go. They were the first to fall. And like I said, the DMV works well, and the the employment centers did work well. But they probably should have diversified a little more. Instead of 3 tenants, they should have found a way to break that up a little more.
Yeah, I'd like to see second chance housing, sort of like a rehab situation. Because a lot of times when you're starting from the bottom, you don't have access to a car. And especially in Tulsa, we're very car-centric in our infrastructure. So having like a laundromat, a grocery store, attached to housing, and all of it air conditioned, in a mall setting, that'd be pretty choice.
And it would be. I'm going to tell you why it doesn't happen. It's because the small real estate is still good real estate. And so something like that is, if it could be attached to something else that was a bigger, better funded investment, if you could carve off a piece, but that's a big chunk of expensive real estate to turn into even market rate housing. It doesn't pencil a lot of the time, and so that's why the housing dream is tricky. You got to have it as part of a network of uses, And that's a hard sell. You typically need to find some deep-pocketed thing to carry the day.
Yeah, and I think that if we calculate all the costs that the city comes up with clearing out all the encampments multiple times a year all around the city, only to have people go to another part where they're, in a couple of weeks they're chased out of there too. Positive solution in investing in housing to solve that, because it is so ridiculous how the city just cruelly cuts down large swaths of trees and foliage just to chase people from one area of wilderness to another. Just really the dumbest thing that I've seen that is a constant practice, not only in Tulsa, but in cities all around the United States.
And I will say that the conversation about using large facilities as housing infrastructure for people on the edge of stability, on the edge of housing stability, is one that even housing stability providers are divided on. Some people believe that you should not try to force tons of people into one space, that is, tricky for logistics and management, but also there's the feeling of, we're putting all these people in a box? That feels weird. That feels like potentially problematic for other reasons. And so it's again, if it's mixed in with other things, rather than say, oh, hey, let's just put all the homeless people in a mall, like, you can see all the ways that can go wrong. And there are plenty of housing advocates who do support it and do see how it can work well, but there are others who don't want to see that happen to their service group. So it's a conversation that's definitely being had, but there's not a consensus on what works. It needs to be tried. It needs to be tried on a moderate scale to see what works and what doesn't. But it's a tricky one.
I think with any development transformation in the city, what it really takes is, especially if it's something particularly imaginative, it takes philanthropy partners, investors, and a mission and people with vision to come together and say, this is how we make it pencil. But in the case of the mall in particular, that element of capitalism feeding for the highest profit margins it can, I can see how you would say that the mall is going to be a tough one to turn into something that's anywhere close to altruistic. Although that said, I really love your idea of the transit hub, because that solves a lot of people's problems, makes existing in this city infinitely better, but is also like a civil service. This is a place where we're actually having this conversation as regular people, and this is how coalitions start to build. They start mentioning who are the people in power that can transform this. How do we, as an organized group of people, reach out to those people to start connecting dots? What resources do you have? What social capital do you have? And can we combine these to make this new vision of what is totally an active space? So again, it's in a name, Dreamland. What is your Dreamland, and how do we make it